it's not about finding a product that extracts more dollars from the consumer. It's about...
Today, I'm joined by Zach Miller, the president of Bucket Squad, created by Jesse Rydell. Do you go broad or do you niche down and increase your ARPU? What's your thought on that?
There are certain creators and certain types of content where it's like, you can have a newsletter, you can have a subscription business, you can have merch. And then there are other businesses where that's not what the audience is interested in. They're interested in coming in and like listening to your podcast and that's it. A really good business sort of operates with a pyramid. As you go up and up that pyramid, you get to a really small group of super fans who really want to go super deep with you.
Very high propensity to pay, buy anything you sell.
Yeah, exactly. We know Disney is this like monolithic integrated media company, but there was a period of time when they were just like putting it together piece by piece. I believe that we could be the biggest sports entertainment product business in the world. And if everyone in the team believes that, what in the world is stopping us from going out and doing that?
That's the kind of rigor you got to bring. Zach, thanks for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
All right. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
The big reason I wanted to have you on for this podcast today, and I think one of the things I think we could explore a bit is, one of our goals with the Creator COO community is to build a bigger group of potential high quality COOs like you to support the creators that we love. And I think that one of the things that we've been exploring lately is where do we find the next class of creator CEOs? Where are they coming from? So I'd love to dig into that, maybe explore your background a little bit and see if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I mean, my background, I think what you'll find probably is people in roles like this have like very unconventional backgrounds and all sorts of different backgrounds. My background, sort of to go through it quickly, I started my career in the movie business as a development executive and producer, and pivoted quickly from like the mainstream studio world into like a more startup-y indie world, which was a great place to be in like the early 2000s, but pretty quickly became a very challenging space. And so when that happened, like 2007 writer's strike, a lot of indie studios closing, I ended up going to business school. I went to Wharton, then I ended up working at McKinsey because, frankly, I didn't know what to do coming out of business school, and that just
I feel like that's a pretty common feeling for a lot of new grads.
And I always wanted to do entertainment, and media and storytelling. Like that's what I always loved. But I also was like, after my time in the movie business, I was like, it'd be nice to like be able to make a little bit of money too, and like get hired long term. So business school and consulting felt like a good way to like have that kind of a foundation. And then from consulting, I really didn't know what to do, and so I ended up going into direct to consumer startups because it was 2014 and really good time to be in like the mobile space and learn the startup space, and felt like that's where all of exciting change was happening. And legacy media businesses weren't necessarily, they were like watching that the mobile space was developing, but also like afraid of it because it was going to disrupt their business, which is kind of a pretty consistent theme. And so I ended up working at a direct-to-consumer e-commerce startup called Spring, and then a streaming startup in the fitness space, sort of a competitor to Peloton called Aptiv.
Okay.
And then when neither of those startups exited for $1 billion, I was like, oh, maybe I should go get like a grown-up job. And I ended up going to NBCU to do strategy and business development, and then went to Spotify after that to do basically more of the same, strategy and BD. And after 4 years of that, I realized that doing strategy at a really big corporate environment was just not something. I sort of knew that after my time at McKinsey, that it was not something I really wanted to do, but I guess I had to learn that lesson twice. And then when I left Spotify, I really thought, like, what do I want to do and where is there opportunity? And I thought about going to another big media company, but I didn't think that was going to be a good place to be for the next 10 or 20 years. I felt like those companies are, if they're not shrinking, their growth is slowing dramatically. And the good jobs in those companies are going to be fought over by the people who have put in like 10 and 20 years in those places. And so I felt like that would be a pretty challenging place to be, and also not a place that my experience told me was a place that was a really good fit for me. And I thought about going into the startup space again, but it felt like that area was also like pretty challenged from a venture standpoint, just sort of a tough cycle uh,
Sure.
to
Yeah.
enter into, with high valuations and uncertainty in terms of these companies' ability to raise capital. Um, and so I thought about, where else could I go work? And like what I really was excited about was like, where can I find an opportunity to work with creative people, support the creative process, like see the stuff that I'm working on actually get out the door and go into the market and engage with consumers. And I had spent time at Spotify looking at the creator economy, um, because Spotify was trying to bring podcast creators and video podcast creators onto the platform, and that was a big part of the growth for the business. And so, yeah, so the confluence of all of that stuff led me to sort of get this crazy idea. Like, I saw Mr. Beast had hired Mark Hustvedt, and I know that that business at the time I think was doing like 100 million in revenue, and had a really massive valuation, like north of $1 billion. And I just sort of thought to myself, like, well, there must be other creators that are smaller, that than that, but that are still big enough that they would be in a position where they might want to bring
Sure.
in an experienced executive to help like steer the growth. And so like that's how my path led to where I am today, is like I kind of got that idea and then threw myself into the space and just met a ton of people and rolled the dice. Was like, I'm going to do this for 6 months and meet a ton of people and see if I can find an opportunity. And I got lucky and came across a couple of opportunities, and one that was like a really good fit. But like, to answer your question, like, where are people going to come from? Like, I think you're going to see people from mainstream media over time realizing, like, I think I was a little bit early. This is like the first time in my career that I ever got something. I don't want to say it's like I've only been doing it for 5 months, but it feels like I got something right and I got it a little bit ahead of like the trend.
Yeah.
Normally I'm like,
It does seem like a pretty well, I wanna double click into a term that you used because you said roll the dice, and it strikes me that a lot of the other moves you made in your career are pretty well, they're sort of well-trod career paths there. McKinsey, engagement manager to partner, strategy at a big,
yeah, like
a
how
big
come
a big
those things didn't work
corporation.
out for me?
Well, how do you think about the risk reward profile of taking a COO job?
I think the answer to that question is like really about like, where are you in your career and like what do you want? So it's like, and also like, I think the answer to so many of those questions is like, what else can you see yourself doing? Like, and what matters to you, right? So it's like, if what matters to you is just making tons of money, sure, then like, keeping your head down at a place like McKinsey and like getting promoted to partner or director, or even like a big media company, is probably like a better long-term path. But I tried those paths and I was okay. I was okay. I mean, I was like serviceable, but um, it didn't really
Yeah.
resonate with me. Like, I didn't love it, and I wasn't because I didn't love it, I wasn't great at it. And so it's like, um, I guess the way I answer the question is like, for me, it was increasingly important to find something that I loved. Like, I started by doing
Totally
something
makes
I
sense.
loved.
Like, not everybody's a ruthless profit maximizer. You don't have to be. But then I actually one of the points you made there I think is really cool, which is that if you really love the thing that you're doing, you're going to be better at it.
Well, I think that's the big takeaway. It's like, I hear like Scott Galloway saying like, oh, they say, at commencement speech addresses, say, find something you love, find your passion. And I agree with Scott Galloway that like, if your passion is to be like a professional athlete, like, good luck, like the odds are really stacked against you. But I also think, and then he says like, well, those people who made billions of dollars, like they made it like in mining businesses, and did they love mining? Like, no, they were like good at that, and then they loved that. So I think there is some truth to that. Like, find what you're good at, and you can learn to love that. And people generally love the things that they're great at. because you learn and you get better, and there's a competitive element to it. But I
Sure.
also think that, like, learn the type of environment that you like being in. Like, do you like being in a big company or a small company? Do you like wearing multiple hats or wearing one hat? Like, do you like structure and stability, or like ambiguity, and the fact that like you could get thrown all sorts of random things that come up every day. Like I had to kind of go through that a handful of times. And it's funny, the
And there
first
was
job,
this the self-reflection or self-assessment process you went through
yeah, I mean, and
along the
also
way.
like when I started my career, I was thrown into an entrepreneurial film environment. It was creative, it was entrepreneurial. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But I had no other experience to compare it to. And so it wasn't until I like, and then I ended up pivoting because I was like, I'd like to make money, and I'm nervous about how well this film business, this indie theatrical film business, and by the way, like the indie theatrical film business is a pretty tough business 20 years later. So I don't really regret not sticking around in that. Um,
Made the
but
right
like
call on that one.
I had to go into like consulting and then working at big media companies to learn like that really doesn't, there's a lot about that corporate cultural environment that just isn't as good a fit for like who I am as a person, the way I like to operate, the things I like to do. It doesn't mean that you can't find those environments in those businesses. I mean, there are certainly like, smaller groups and more skunk worksy startup-y type groups in bigger companies. Um, but like I had to learn that about myself and take this like almost like 15-year circuitous journey to like wind up at a company that's like actually quite similar to the
To
company
maybe
I
to where you
started
started
with.
in some ways.
Yeah, and the thing is that like in 2003, indie theatrical film, like, this is sort of like post sun the initial Sundance wave and like Miramax, and that was like a viable path for a couple of years. If I had graduated in like 95, that might have been a really great place to be in at the time. But the internet around 2001, 3, 4, something like that started disintermediated. And then it wasn't until 2012 that YouTube started really monetizing. And it wasn't until like 10 years later that you started to have like real businesses, or I mean, maybe 5 years later, like you have Mythical and you have
Sure.
Mr. Beast and,
So
the,
you're
you know,
you're watching this trend unfold. You you even said yourself you're a bit of an early mover to this market. You're looking at Mythical, you're looking at Mr. Beast. You see there's something there. You give yourself 6 months to meet a bunch of people and figure out what to do next. My guess is you talked to a lot of people and saw a lot of opportunities, but ultimately you decided to go be the president and work with Jesser at Bucket Squad. What was it about that opportunity that pulled you in?
well, I mean, it was a few things. First of all, when I met Jesse and Christina and Jason, who were like, the people leading the business, they were just all awesome. And, people is so huge. Um, I think the content and what they had done and built, like really had like clear, I guess, to use like a tech term, product market fit. They
Sure.
had a real audience that they understood, and the content like was really resonating with that audience, and they had demonstrated a lot of, like, I think what drew me to the creator world was that initially, or like the thesis was, you build an audience around a particular content type, and then you have an audience. And like it used to be that if you wanted to have an audience and build and monetize an audience, you needed to be a big publisher or a big studio or a big broadcast network. And the creator space has made it so that an individual creator or a group of creators can build an audience, and then they have that audience like direct to the consumer. And so the question for businesses like that from a growth standpoint, or at least what I was thinking about, was like, how do you then introduce new products and services and content and diversify your offerings to that audience so you can build different businesses for that audience? I mean, it's no different from like the Today Show having like
Sure.
a broadcast TV business. And I mean, I worked at NBCU and I worked with the Today Show. And then they're like, well, a lot of our audience buys product. So like, let's launch Shop Today, which becomes the Today Show's e-commerce business, which is like one of the biggest e-commerce businesses among any media business. So it's like, take that same sort of philosophy and bring that to an individual creator where they've built that business themselves. They don't need an NBCU. They don't need a broadcast distribution channel in order to do that. So
And it makes
um,
sense to me that you would understand that. Was Jesse thinking the same way when you guys started your conversations?
that's the thing, is that like they had already started doing that
Okay.
by launching the Bucket Squad apparel brand. And they were smart also to recognize that like it was a good idea to diversify away from this key man risk that is like that affects a lot of creators, which is that they are so central to everything. How can they build things that do not rely on them, like they don't have to be on camera for? The fact that they launched an apparel brand under a name different from Jesser, where the apparel brand, Jesser can support the apparel brand, but the apparel brand doesn't rely exclusively on Jesser. So those were all like really strong signals and indicators that they intrinsically saw the business opportunity similar to the way that I saw it. So I would say it's that. It was like seeing that. It was the people. And I'll say two things. One is, and then it was also the
You're
subject
also
matter.
a pretty big basketball fan too,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think.
So that's what I was going to say is like I
That
met a
doesn't hurt.
handful of creators and I was excited about all of their content, but like I am just, as much as I like love storytelling and YouTube and content and you know, media and tech and monetization, I love the NBA as much or more. And I know the NBA as well or better because I literally am like obsessed with it. Like today is the first day back from the All-Star break. And like I've been starving for NBA. Like I get to watch the Knicks tonight. I get to watch like other games tonight. I'm like so excited. And so I think, you know, we connected over the NBA. And I also felt like, wow, you know, my knowledge of the NBA can be a real asset, that a real differentiator in this role that like for another, you know, other creators, maybe like a creator in the medical space or a creator in the, you know, creator business space wouldn't necessarily like, I don't have as much to offer there. And so that was a really good fit. But I'll also say, you know, I just connected with the team over the content and the basketball element of it.
Yep.
The other thing I'll say is that you know, I thought that the team was really pretty professional, especially for like a bunch of young people who had built this business like entrepreneurially their own. But
Which I
also
think is pretty rare,
yeah,
actually.
I mean, I think you know, I'm finding in this space there are creators who like are just totally happy just being creators. That's what they want to do.
Yep.
And then there are creators who are like ambitious and they want to build a media business. They see the opportunity. They want to go after it. Like they just every day wake up and want to do more and different stuff. And Jesse and the team at Bucket Squad are totally like that. And I didn't need to like come in and bring that spirit. Like that spirit was here and was very attractive to me. And also Jesse is like really one of the most impressive people I've come across like in my professional career. Like in the movie business, in mainstream media when or tech when I worked there, like he's like a young guy who has a really incredible instinct about
Mm,
content, storytelling, audience, tech platforms, what will work, what won't work. And it's clearly not like a taught thing, it's a self taught thing. It's either an intuitive thing that he has, or it's something he's learned by studying the space as like a kid and growing up, not only studying it as a consumer, but also
sure.
like making content, experimenting, testing, and learning. And it's like, really second hand to him. And it's incredible asset to someone like me in my role because it's like, look, you know, there are things that I know and that I can add to this business. And then there's a lot in this space that I don't know. And I think there are a lot of people who would come into a role like mine and come in and be like, act like they know everything and just say, this is what we're going to do and
Sure.
chart everything themselves. And what I've learned in like my 5 months is that my first 5 months is that um, like Jesse's instincts are so critical, have absolutely driven the success of this business, and are critical to the next waves of growth of this business. And in some ways, yes, my job is to like add structure and, add rigor to the way that we make business decisions and
Yeah.
help bring a management culture and things like that. But my job is also to, listen to the wisdom of all of the native creator economy people in the company and like un- identify when they have really, really sharp instincts and like drive around those instincts rather than be a business guy who comes in and steamrolls all those instincts. Like that would be the biggest mistake I could make. Not only would it miss opportunities, but it would also like get me fired very quickly.
Sure. I want to spend some time in a minute on what that first 30, 60, 90 has been like
Sure.
for you. But before we talk about that, I'm curious back to your experience of coming in or sort of preparing to come into Bucket Squad.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me, like you identified this opportunity in the market, met this team that you really loved and respected. What about from his point of view? Like, what was happening in the business at the time where he was saying to himself, I need a COO. I need somebody like Zach.
I mean, look, it's hard for like it's going to be mostly conjecture on my part because I wasn't there. But I think being on the inside and looking back or kind of understanding the company, um, I think the company had just achieved really great growth with a young team that did an incredible job identifying opportunities and managing the growth, but like a combination of the number of people in the company. I think that was a big driver, as well as like the scale of revenues that the company was reaching, and then also the complexity of like managing effectively three businesses, two video businesses and one direct to consumer business, and then additional verticals and businesses. Um, I don't want to say like threatening, but kind of like percolating, threatening to like pop up. I
Yeah,
think they were realizing that like this is starting to get more complex. This is starting to get harder to manage. Like we're able to sort of entrepreneurially guide this thing so far, but it's starting to get big enough and complex enough. And I think it's partially things like you bring on enough employees, you need to implement healthcare for the entire,
sure.
and benefits for the team. You have to start putting, organizational processes in place. And I think that when you get to a certain level, you start to think like, well, we could trial and error our way through this, and it's going to be a lot more time consuming, and we're going to break a lot more eggs along the way. Or we could bring someone in who's seen it a few times before and can
Hmm.
like, bring their past experiences to bear and all of the mistakes that were made elsewhere, so we don't have to make those mistakes. So I think that was the thinking. I also think the team had done a spotter deal, so there was
This
um,
is where they sold off some of the rights to the back catalog.
yeah, and that effectively pulls future revenues forward and sort of serves as like a capital, like a slug of capital into the
Sure.
business. So I think it was a combination of the needs of the business and then the freedom and flexibility that is afforded by like when you're running a business, it's a profitable business, you're making a little bit of money each month. It's hard to really make big changes when you are like, yeah, you're building up a war chest, but like you're building
Yeah.
up a war chest slowly. When you do
You have
something
a
like
you have a
that,
working capital problem unless you solve that with something like Spotter.
but it's not just about the capital that it's more about the confidence of like, okay, we have like a war chest now. We
Yeah.
could take, I think hiring an experienced executive, or frankly putting it in different terms, hiring someone who's like 45 is a bit of a risk for a
Sure.
business like that. Like it's like you don't know if the person's going to work out, you don't know if the culture's going to fit, you don't know if, and so it's like it's a bit of a commitment, and I think that companies need to get themselves to a place where they feel comfortable taking that risk. Just like anything, it's similar to like launching a new business. Like if we're going to launch a new business, there needs to be some rigor around it, and we need to have a reason to believe that like it'll make more money than it'll cost us. But we also need to have enough money in the bank that if it is a total failure, we can keep doing what we're doing and it
Then
doesn't
we're
really
okay.
hurt us. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
The
So
psychological confidence piece makes of having a war chest makes a ton of sense. The okay, so you're coming into this new role. You're the, as you said, the 45-year-old guy coming into a YouTube business.
Yeah.
What was your plan of attack for the first 1 to 3 months? How do you think about
Well,
approaching this?
it's funny. I had, you know, I'd never done like a 30, 60, 90-day plan in my life. And I thought this felt like a really good time to do it for the first time. So I sat down and I sort of thought about like, what are all, I sort of, this is how I tend to work is like, I sit down with like a bunch of ideas on a white piece of paper. And then I start to bucket them and like group them into different themes and whatnot. And it's actually not as fresh in my mind right now as maybe it was when we talked like a few months ago. Um, but I sat down and like I basically laid out what do I think are all the opportunities in the business, what are the things that we could go and do, but then
Mm,
as it relates to all of that, like what are the things that I need to do in the first 90 days in order to build a stronger conviction
mm.
around what we can do and what we should or shouldn't do. And so
And
those,
presumably what you were saying about the confidence in the war chest, you've already got things that are working really well. So you don't
yeah,
want to mess those things up and throw those off course.
well, 100%. I mean, I think so much. So really the things that I coalesced around were like, I need to get to know the team and the business. That was like one. Two is that, or I need to get to know the people, really understand all the people. What does everybody do? Like how does this business create value and how is it a function of the individuals? And not only do I need to understand that, but I need to build relationships and like, you know, I need to learn them and what they do, but I need to also
Meet the
like
team, learn the business,
make
build
myself
trust.
available and like earn trust. Like I need to go in there and like earn everybody's trust. I don't need to go in there and just like understand and evaluate. Like I need to actually like if I'm going to be successful in a role like this, like I have to recognize that like I could be a real culture shock as a very sharp guy in the industry who's a recruiter in the space, a search executive in the space. John McCarris says, like, is the is the body going to reject the organ? Like, as a transplant, am I going to get in there and it's going to be like, no, this isn't working. Sorry. Like, I had to make sure that I had to learn, like, how do I fit into this organization that is already exists, already successful, already doing things right? How do I build relationships with people? How do I figure out how I can add value to what they're doing? And so much of that is relationship based.
As the odd guy from the corporate world coming in, were there any like group norms or cultural norms that you struggled to adapt to?
Nothing that jumps out at me like, oh, that was like real point of friction. But I think that there was just a lot of like real time adaptation.
Mm,
Um, you know, I guess one example is like the majority, this is not a big email culture. Like I'm
mm.
used to being in environments where like everything runs off of email and calendar. And so it's like, this is like, I mean, I'm used to Slack culture, I'm used to texting, but like a lot of our business runs off of like Slack, text, Telegram. Telegram
Interesting.
was brand new to me. I had not used Telegram, although it's like just like WhatsApp or anything else. Um, but you know, if I have an announcement for the company, like something around healthcare, something around like, payroll details, your W
Sure.
2s, whatever.
You gotta figure out how to broadcast that out.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, how do you message everyone and have security knowing that like everyone's reading it and digesting it? That was a bit of a norm that I think I had to work through. But to get back to your question about 30, 60, 90, the first one was people. The second one was get under the hood of the finances. And one of the things I realized is that like one of the areas where I could add a lot of value immediately was in like putting a little rigor around the way that you manage a business from a financial standpoint. So like really looking at the business ac- across revenue lines and like
Mm,
allocating costs to revenue lines so that you can actually look at what the revenue contribution, profit contribution is for each business. And then I don't want to say report on it because it's not like we have a board. It's like I'm sharing this information with Jesse and some of the leaders in the company, but once you start looking at that stuff, like they often say, like, you can't move what you can't measure.
Yeah.
It's like,
Measure what matters.
yeah, exactly. Measure what matters is a few different ways of saying sort of the same thing. And like, I just came in and it was like, sure, we have a budget and we do reconcile finances on a monthly basis, but we're not looking at it a layer or two deep. So when we start thinking about things like what can we afford from a production budget standpoint per video, like, well, we need to really look at, like, on a video by video basis, how much revenue does it generate? What is the cost associated with it? Like, so I,
Yeah, that's a fun example. So, like, are there any other? Could you give any other examples of decisions that you pieces of the business that you approach differently, or decisions that you made differently because you had that next level deeper view into finances?
I mean, I would say that we haven't yet started making decisions. Well, so when I joined, I thought we were going to just jump in and launch like a couple of new business lines.
Mm,
And I think what we all realized relatively quickly into my joining is that there's a lot of organizational and operational and infrastructure stuff that makes a lot of sense to do right now because this is a growing company.
sure.
It's profitable. It has a lot of tailwinds. And because it's growing, it's reasonable to expect that it's going to continue growing for a while. And like I think we all realize it makes a lot of sense to like put in the time right now to establish that infrastructure, make investments that will help stabilize the business for growth, focus on some things that aren't necessarily like direct revenue generating, but they are, good for the overall growth or like moat of the business to protect the business's position. But like those types of things are like, let's build organizational foundations, let's build financial foundations, let's start
So
looking at the
that's so
numbers.
yes, the things that aren't directly revenue contributing, it's like getting your categorization in QuickBooks correct. It's rolling out benefits for the team. It's
Yeah, exactly. I
yeah,
mean, so like to be able to have all of your revenues and costs tagged properly and be able to cut your QuickBooks data in a really insightful or like just useful and accurate way so that each, you know, general manager of each business unit can actually look at their own P&L and make decisions. It's like you could either approach hiring where you're like looking at the aggregate revenues and costs of the business and people are saying, hey, I want to hire this role, and you're like, can we hire this role? I don't really know. Or you can actually be like looking at the profits, the revenues and cost and profit and loss of each
right.
business unit and say, all right, well, if we hire this role, how much revenue do we think, like, is this business in a place where we can afford some more cost without it directly driving revenue? Or is this business unit in a place where every role that we hire needs to drive incremental revenue? Because, which of the business units are profit drivers and which are not? Or where should we lean into for growth because it's a bigger contributor to profit? You have to do a lot of like fundamental blocking and tackling if you're a business that hasn't been operating that way, and that is like the boring stuff that like nobody wants to spend any time on.
Sure.
Um,
It's not sexy to tag things the right way in QuickBooks, but it's really important.
well, and once it's done, it's like you do it once, you put in the time to do it, and then it's there. And then whenever questions come up, it's like, well, I could answer this question in a totally opaque way based on my gut, or I could like run off a quick report and sit with the person who's asking me the question and be like, let's look at this together. What do you think? Do you think that we should hire this role, or do you think that we shouldn't? Like, you're responsible for this
Yeah.
bit.
I like that reframing. You could if you do it the right way, you can just bring the data to the table and end up at the answer pretty organically.
If you want people to be able to like be autonomous and like really be in charge of their business, then you have to like give them the information in order to make those decisions. And like, and it's quite daunting if you're like a creative executive who's running like a video channel. It's like pretty daunting to think about like, how am I going to aggregate all of these costs and revenues, and how am I going to like really know what the cost on my businesses, and then think about like all of the overhead. How do you allocate salaries that are for people who are spread across businesses? And I mean, it gets complicated. So that was like a piece where I was like, this is a beneficial thing to do. And then
Sure.
I think the last piece was to like basically bring um, the relationships with the people and understanding their work and everything that they're doing, the rigor around the business, and sort of bring those things together into a third piece, which is like a planning process. And so
Mm,
that was, my goal was basically to say, all right, I want to finish 90 days and be in a position where I have the relationships and credibility with the team where I can engage in some kind of a, what do we want 2024 to look like as a business, but also have the numbers underneath it so I could bring the numbers to the group and be like, this is what last year looked like. If we don't do anything differently, this is what next year looks like from a forecasting standpoint. Do we want to add a bunch of businesses? Do we want to just focus
yeah.
on the core? What are our hiring goals? Like, do that in sort of a structured way. And that sort of became, um, I think what I realized was like, the team is doing so many of the things right. And like,
Right.
so much of what my role is like, how do I put a little structure and process and organization around so much of what they're doing right? And then when they want to do new things, enable it to be like a slightly more, like, it's still a creative decision, but like a creative decision that's informed by like some analytical underpinning. um, and maybe I'm doing a little bit of back of the envelope math, and to like try and, if someone's like, hey, I think we should do this business, I could maybe be like, all right, well, this is what I think this business is worth, and this is what it costs. Do we want to
Yeah.
do this one, or do we want to do that one? And the truth is that we ended up not doing as much of that. We ended up focusing much more on a few strategic imperatives to start the year, and I think we'll probably get into some more of that growth stuff in the second half of the year or early 2025.
Makes sense. I I, I can relate to some of the things you were saying there. By the way, I think when I came into Uscreen, bootstrap business, very similar in construct in some ways. I think to what Bucket Squad probably looked like, and Jesse and his team. Um, Going through that first planning process was a really big change. What was what was that experience like going through the first annual planning or quarterly planning process?
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, I think that the team did at some annual planning. I think it was much more goal setting,
Mm.
and I think that the team just had really good instincts on like what goals they wanted to achieve. Um,
And which is true at Uscreen too, right? I think of course before I joined, the business was a $10 million ARR business, and so obviously the team's doing a lot of things right.
right, sure.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
what did you layer on top of the process that already existed, and then what was that experience like for you and the team?
So I mean, the truth is that like it's been pretty iterative. Like, we did our best to try and get everything in shape by the end of December. In order, I started in September, and so I guess 90 days was
And that's
middle.
a pretty quick turnaround to get a bunch of infrastructure and financial infrastructure in
And I
place
think
and
that that's
launch a
what
plan
we
process.
realized was that like getting it all in place in time to really do that process right was not, weren't able to do it. So I think what we had by the end of the year was like a pretty good view of what like the next year could look like if we didn't do anything differently.
Yep.
So we had like a good baseline to work from, and we had a
Yep.
lot of ideas of what we wanted to do, but we came back from the new year and we're still working on it. And the truth is that there have been a couple of things that have happened in the business over the last 2 months that, like adding benefits and like changing payroll providers and things that like were pretty I don't want to say disruptive, but just took a lot of time and attention. And so
Mhm.
if I'm being totally honest, I would say like 6 weeks into the year, we're still iterating on what that budget and forecast looks like. We're still iterating on like what our priorities are. And so what I'd say is like we started that process. We were looking at a lot of potential new businesses to stand up. And within the first couple of weeks of January, we realized that there was a different list of priorities that we wanted to
Mm.
focus on. And so then that forecast sort of became our budget, or our like, we said, okay, 2024 is actually not going to be a year where we're banking on launching a ton of new businesses. And if we launch anything new, we're not banking on a ton of revenue coming from those in 2024. Like we might launch some things in the second half of the year, but
Yep.
if you start some things up in the second half of the year, you're not going to really see something at steady state until the very end of the year or the beginning of the next year. And so that just meant that like really sophisticated forecasting was not something that we really needed to do. Like we didn't need to model these new businesses as aggressively. Instead, it became, all right, let's look inward. Let's put processes in place. Let's put structure in place.
And as you're thinking about building your baseline for the business, what is your business model today? What are the revenue lines that you care about right now?
So, oh, and by the way, when you were saying like the 30, 60, 90-day plan, like for me, so much of it was about like learn, like get
Mm,
information. So it was like learn the team, learn the financials. Who is our customer? Like who is our audience member? And what I found was like YouTube has a ton of great data, but YouTube's data kind of falls short in a lot of ways. Like
hmm.
you want to know, like you can know what country people are in.
Okay.
I don't think you may be able to tell in America what state people are in, but you certainly don't have city data. So let's say you wanted to launch an events business. So, like for example, Mythical has a tour,
Yeah.
and they were able, like they know from other research they've done where their audience is in the United States and cities.
Sure.
That's incredibly valuable when you're planning a tour. Like, where critical masses of audience members are, where your fanatical fans are, where the demand is. Like, so what I realized was, and we have a young audience that ranges, but like some of our audience are either on their parents' accounts or they are not old enough to be
Yeah.
officially accounts on YouTube. And so
Yep.
that also makes our data somewhat less valuable. So one of the things that we did early on when I joined was like pull together a survey and run a survey out to the market, which is actually live in market right
Mm,
now. And yeah, it's self-reported data. And yeah, the respondents may not be representative of our whole audience, but it's at least a leading indicator of like our fanatical
right.
fans.
Your audience, your true fans, and your ideal customer profile. Because you
Yeah.
really can't make any decisions until you
Well,
understand that
and
really
so that
well.
was the thing. It was like, let's understand the team, let's understand our financials, let's understand our business units and how they're performing, let's understand our customer, and then let's digest all of that data and like collaboratively as a team really think through like what do we think are the right opportunities. Um so sorry, so I brought us back to the 30, 60, 90 day. What was the question that you had asked?
What is you were talking a bit about establishing a baseline for the business for planning. And I thought it could be interesting just to click into what the business looks like today and how you think about the top co and the sub co's and then the various revenue lines.
Yeah, so like so basically we have three businesses. We have the main Jesser channel, which, and I think about the businesses as revenue lines, right? Like we have a bunch of people who work on things and that generates, that audience coalesces around it and we're able to monetize that audience, uh, you know, in different ways. And so we have the main Jesser channel, which publishes like 3 to 4 videos a month. We have 18 million subscribers on that. Videos do on average like, 2 million views per video. And we generate revenue there through YouTube AdSense and brand, on camera read brand sponsorships.
Sure.
We have the Jesser Reacts channel, which publishes a lot more frequently, was publishing up to like 20 videos a month. Now we're doing fewer videos, but longer videos. So we're doing about 10 a month, but still a lot more than on the main channel. And that doesn't do as much brand sponsorship, but it's doing a lot more in 2024. And like, I think one of our goals is to do more and more brand sponsorship on that content. But that's largely AdSense. And then we have direct to consumer e-commerce business, Bucket Squad Apparel, which is growing like crazy. Um, and um, and so like we organize the business around those three business lines and have like leaders who are running each of those business lines.
Okay.
And I think the way we think about the business is we have an aggregate community that we engage with across those three revenue channels, and we engage them across social and other channels. And I think and then I think we I am thinking across all three. The people who are running those businesses are really
Right.
laser focused on those businesses. And I think we have to do that because we have to keep making sure that each of those businesses is just amazing and the content is amazing and it's evolving with what, Jesse's creative and the creative
I-
leaders of those
Is
businesses.
each of those GMs functionally tied to the P&L in some way
Yeah.
of each of
And
the subcos?
yes, and I mean, increasingly, that's something that like we have to keep doing better financial back end tagging and really giving full transparency. But yes, like they are currently doing that, and we just need to provide better, more accurate, increasingly accurate data so they can make better decisions. But that was one of the initial ideas was like there is almost like a natural structure that was in place, but it hadn't been codified. And so, from an organizational and operational standpoint, like I came in and I was like, I feel like there's like this natural org here, but I also don't want to be this guy who comes in and like forces like some overly structured org
Right.
chart and reporting and
Right.
management. And I was like, all right, so like maybe I'll just sort of sit back and, not force that stuff and just like let things, keep operating the way they're operating naturally. And I sort of was like, I'll wait until I don't want to introduce these things proactively because there's a real concern that, well, first of all, like I may just be doing that out of like my own sense of discomfort. Like,
Right.
oh, it'll make me feel more comfortable if there's like a clear organizational structure, but like maybe that is not solving a problem for anybody else but me. And like
Sure.
I shouldn't necessarily be doing that like to meet my needs. I should be focusing on the needs of the company and the needs of the people around
I
me
mean,
and like serving them.
I would think like philosophically having really clear lines of ownership for certain metrics and business outcomes typically helps. And it's really cool to hear that that happened organically. It's sort of, I think what you're saying is you just sat back and observed it. It was already happening. So maybe you put a little more definitions around it, but kind of a natural structure.
Yes. And I sort of had an idea for how it should look in a more formalized capacity, but I also waited until there were like moments in the business where it was like, all right, putting a little more definition around this will actually solve this problem. Like,
Right.
we have people who are working across multiple businesses and it's not clear who they report
Mm,
to or who their manager is, like
right.
who they go to in terms of a problem, who has final decision on this thing or that thing. And so like when enough of those moments emerged, I was like, oh, you know what would help solve this? Like, let's just put a simple, like, let's just define the org structure. And then it wasn't like I'm some guy who's coming in and saying, we need to put org structure in place because that's what people do in businesses. It was like,
Right.
you know, uh, the ambiguity or the uncertainty that different people are facing and they don't know who to go to with this thing or that thing, um, will be cleared up if we do this. And so I think that made it so that any of those types of more traditional structural things put in place
Yep.
were embraced by people because they were identifying problems that that they didn't want to be dealing with, like problems that are making them less efficient or distraction or creating headaches. And so, um, yeah, that was like a big thinking for me.
Makes sense. You've talked a lot about the infrastructure you put in place and the base case for Bucket Squad. But
Yeah.
what's the big idea? What's the big business opportunity for you and Jesse and the team?
I don't know that there's a single big idea that we are clear on it being like this is going to be the magic bullet. The way I think about it is, and this is somewhat informed by like growing up in like the legacy media space, like as a kid in the 80s and the 90s, like watching that type of content, and then in my like 20s, like studying that stuff and then going and working in those businesses. Like I'm just a believer that the internet and all of these platforms, and especially YouTube, by really enabling individual content creators to like monetize at scale, what that's done is made it so that if you want to build an audience and with significant monetization, you can do that as an individual going direct to consumer. And what that does is creates a much more fragmented environment, and sort of takes power away from all of these incumbents,
Sure.
like, and when I say incumbents, like ABC, like all the broadcast networks who for many years, like the only way you could get to an audience was if you had like one of the four broadcast networks. Then it was the cable networks. It's always been the studios and the news publishers and magazine publishers. But now increasingly we saw a wave of like the Vice magazines and BuzzFeeds and Complexes and um, and Voxes and those guys sort of shake up those legacy brands. And now we're seeing the Mr. Beasts of the world. And like, I mean, I keep going back to a bunch of the same names, but like Mr. Beast, Mythical, Eric, um, and I see Jesser as like a channel that has really established a foothold in sports entertainment. I mean, Dude Perfect is another great
Well,
example.
it's interesting that you didn't say basketball. You said sports entertainment. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think basketball is kind of a beachhead, I mean, and I think Jesse's already done that. I mean, he's done football content, he's done soccer.
Mm,
And it's funny, like when I joined, one of the questions that I asked Jesse was similar to what you're saying. It's like, what is our brand? Like, what do you think the Jesser brand is? What do you think the Bucket Squad brand is? And, you know, I'm not a branding expert and I've only been through like a couple of processes in the past, but like I know enough to be dangerous. And so, you know, the exercise in many cases is like, well, let's get more specific. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, let's keep drilling down to get to
sure.
something a little bit. And one of the things that happened in a conversation around that was like Jesse, when pressed on it, talked about how it's more than even just sports. It's like it's about the joy. One of the things he said, I think, was it's about the joy of activity. And so it's, if you notice, the content is in a lot of ways about like being outdoors and running around and doing stuff with friends and like playing competitive sports or playing competitive games and activity. And it's in so many ways it's about the fun of doing that and the joy that comes from that. And so that's actually like a quite broad idea.
It's
And the
broad, yeah.
broader,
So
you want
there
to be
could be an
specific,
opportunity to.
you want to stand for something, but you also want
Mhm.
to be broad to appeal to as big of an audience as possible, right? And so like basketball is part of it, but like, for us, like I think long term, like it's not just men's basketball, it could be women's basketball. It's not just basketball, it's sports. It's not just sports, it's activity. And it's also about like the community and the connectivity and the joy and the satisfaction and experience that comes with all of that stuff. And so if that's what we stand for, then the question is like, how do you build a multi-channel media
Mm,
commerce experiential business? Like I think about it and I'm like, we have an audience of 25 million people. First of all, how do we make that 50 million, 100 million? Like there are a lot more people out there. How do we reach them? And then
yeah.
secondly, what are the things that that audience would be interested in from us? Like we monetize well today with advertising. We monetize well with direct to consumer commerce. What does an events business look like for us? What is a
Mm,
subscription like? How do we add real value to the consumer? in a paid direct to consumer paid capacity, because there are things you can do if consumers pay you directly that you can't do if you're just monetizing on ads. And so
Yeah, the audience sizing and like the branding thing, it's kind of an interesting conundrum. We see a lot of creators face this where like, basketball alone is such a big market internationally. Men's basketball alone is big. Then you can add on women's basketball, uh, NBA versus collegiate. I mean, it's a huge market. And so I do find a lot of creators, they run into this conundrum where, do you go broad or do you niche down, and do you go broad for a larger audience and potentially larger ad revenues or just bigger exposure over time, or do you niche down and increase your ARPU? What's your thought on that?
So I think it's a great question, a really important question. Really sharp guy at YouTube named Andrew Leonard asked me very similar question. I think he had made like a presentation about that dichotomy, that like trade-off. And one of the things that he said is like, it's really, you got to know your audience, right? Like, is your audience the kind of audience that just wants to go deeper with you? Or is your audience the kind of audience that is not really so interested in going deeper? And so your way of growing is to
Mm,
broaden the audience. And so, like, um, think about it as like there are certain creators and certain types of content where it's like you can have a newsletter, you can have a subscription business, you can
yeah,
have merch, you can have a video bit, a video ad supported video business, you can have events. Like they just want more and more of you, and more of what you offer. And then there are other businesses where it's like, you know, you just that's not what the audience is interested in for you. Like they're interested in coming in and like listening to your podcast and that's it, and they come and go. And
sure.
so I think to some extent you need to understand what your natural product market fit, like your natural relationship with the audience is, and then what they do
What do
and
you
don't
what do you
want
think
more.
that is for you? Like if you had to think about the sequencing of like going deeper and doing the greater ARPU thing first,
I think
or going more broad reach?
it's a really hard question. So one of the reasons why we ran the
The
survey out
answer
of
might be you don't
market
know. The
is
answer
to
might be you
try and
don't
answer
know,
that.
which is interesting in and of itself.
I mean, what's interesting is that like when Andrew asked me that question, I said I kind of think we want to do both.
Mm,
Um, but I do think if we have to choose between the two, or if we have to sequence them, um, I think what we found is that we have really strong appeal to a broad and a broadening audience. So like I would lean. I mean, look, I think I came in thinking let's go deep fast,
yep.
but I think I'm increasingly thinking, and I think this is Jesse's instinct, like let's go broad, let's keep going broad as long as we can go broad, and let's learn how deep we can go. And what we'll find, and this is what I said to Andrew, is like a really good business sort of operates with a pyramid. Like at the bottom, you have your broadest audience that will pay you $0
Right.
directly and you can monetize them. And then among that bottom layer, there's some subsegment that you can upsell into a slightly smaller group
Yep.
and you can get them to pay a little bit. And then
Yep.
as you go up and up that pyramid, you get to a really small group of super fans who really want to go super deep with you. And
Very
so,
high propensity to pay,
you
buy
know,
anything you sell.
and by the way, like at McKinsey, there's a great director, media, TMT, technology, media, and telecom director named Kabir Ahuja, who has once showed me this great uh, product. I guess it's like a demand curve, product demand curve, which talks about how like a
Yep.
good business has a suite of products, and it's the same principle, but it basically says like the y-axis is number of people engaging with your product, and
Yep.
the x-axis is like dollars ARPU, like dollars per user
Right.
annually. And the example was like the NFL. And so it's like the free distributed broadcast game is like reaches, we all know, like the largest audience in television today.
Monetize with ads.
But yeah, monetized with ads. But then the next group is like the Sunday Ticket. No, sorry. The
Yep.
next group is the Red Zone. So it's like $4.99 a month, still pretty big audience, but like
Yep.
maybe half the size or a quarter the size. Then the next group is the Sunday ticket audience, who's like, they're watching, they're paying $200 a year, $300 a year. They're watching all the games concurrently. The next group are the people who are like actually going to get off their asses and go to a game. And if
Sure.
you go to 1 or 2 games a year, like they're paying a lot more money for those tickets than Sunday ticket. The next group are people who have season tickets. The next group are the people who go to the playoffs and the Super Bowl. And like Super Bowl tickets this year were like $9,000 in Vegas.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you segment your audience into those
Sure.
different groups and monetize
Yeah,
them?
the more area along the curve you have, the more optimized you are in terms of meeting people where they're willing to pay
Yeah,
for
exactly. And,
value.
and that's the key, is like, how do you discover what somebody wants? That's the thing. Like, you could
How
think about this.
how would you rate yourself and the Bucket Squad business right now along that curve? And in
Like,
terms of
how
like
are we
where
doing
you
in
meet
terms of that?
people, yeah, where you meet people in terms of value and like propensity to pay.
I think we're just doing okay. Like, I think it's super early days, and like,
Yep.
we have we have a lot of free to the consumer content that is ad monetized. That's everything that we have. And then we have an apparel business. And I think even with the apparel business, we haven't really figured out how to optimize the demand curve with the apparel business, because we have a very limited amount of products that are available for under 40
Mm,
bucks. And so like I don't think we really know what the demand is for products under 40 bucks. And that, if you look at America, like there are a lot of consumers who, are price sensitive, whether it's out of their own appetites or whether it's out of like need, you know?
mm.
And so I also think that that's the kind of thing. I mean, look, the NFL is like 100-year-old business, and, very sophisticated, operated, I think, in a
Right.
pretty sophisticated way. The NBA as well. I mean, we're very early, and like we have a
Yep.
lot of learning to do.
But so much opportunity. I mean, it
No,
sounds
so
like
so much opportunity.
you've got over the next 2, 3, 4 years, a lot of places where you can meet the demand of the customer across probably your existing product lines and then also
New
new
product and new
ones.
product lines. But what you said, I think, was really incisive, or like really smart, accurate. Is it's about meeting the customer where they are, because I think some people think like there's a difference between that and upselling people. So like, I don't think
Mm.
what we're trying to do is bring audience members in and then upsell them to like spending more money, which I think the pyramid, it sort of implies more upselling.
But it's also a
We're
very company-centric way to view it as opposed to like a customer-centric way, which would be to say, let's provide an option with much more value that they're also going to pay more
Well,
for.
completely agree. And to your point about meeting them where they are, it's like, it's not about finding a product that extracts more dollars from the consumer. It's about understanding what more the consumer wants, and then finding a way to provide it to them in a way, like like you said, that is where the price is worth the value that they're being given. And so it's like, I think a big part of running this survey out into the market was to say, how can we learn who our customer is, and how can we learn what our customer is really interested in from us, so
Sure.
that we can, to use like Bezos language, or Bezos language, Amazon language, so that we can super serve that customer. And that will unlock opportunities for us to introduce new products and start to optimize that demand curve. But not because we're just trying to like introduce new things and get people to pay for them, but because we're trying to figure out what people actually want, deliver that, and turn those things into viable businesses.
Are there any other creators outside of Bucket Squad that you admire or look up to who you think have done this thing really well? Multiple product lines, price points, optimize the demand curve.
I definitely, I mean, look, Mr. Beast and Mythical are two like really great examples, I think, in the space. I'll also say, I think like Barstool
Sure.
and The Ringer are other examples that are like, The Ringer is a little bit more of a traditional, looks a little bit more like a traditional media company, but it really is like a creator-centric business that did a great job of incubating other creators. Like when you think about the careers of
Mm.
like Ryan Russillo and other people that Bill Simmons has incubated over there. Like I think that's just a really great business, and try to learn from what they've done. Also, like when you think about Barstool, like introducing all of these franchises,
Sure.
and then retaining talent over such a long period of time, and helping and retaining talent in that case is so much about helping that talent achieve their goals, build an audience themselves, but also feel like it's better for them to stay at Barstool and keep growing at Barstool rather than look at Barstool as like, well, this is where I built my platform and now I'm going to go off and do my own thing. Like
Yeah.
to be honest, like Bill Simmons and ESPN is a great example of how not to do it. And Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo is a great example of how to do it, right?
Mm.
Like Bill Simmons was at ESPN. Too much of the value was accruing to ESPN. He was like, I created all of this value for this business, and they
Right.
didn't want to like play ball with him in the way that he thought was fair. And he was like, okay, I sold my business to you. I sold Grantland to you. My earnout's done. Now I'm going to go start a new business,
And
and
and of course, it's so much easier to do that these days. And so I have to imagine the big publishers like ESPN are afraid of that.
he saw that. Like, he's one of the first, honestly. I'd have to like, I'd be hard pressed to think about other people who did that as early.
Yeah.
I think there are a few, but I'd have to think about it.
Have you guys ever thought about doing any M&A to potentially expand the business, like bring in new business units? Or are you pretty much focused for the next few years on organic growth?
So we've had opportunistic conversations. I think it's really got to be like the perfect thing that comes along. I mean, we're not a natural podcasting business,
Mm,
because we're much more like heavily edited video entertainment
sure.
production. We're not like news and analysis right now. But one of the things, especially having coming from Spotify, one of the things that I thought about was like, well, what does like a Bucket Squad audio business look like? And and that,
Hmm.
and it's not something that we're really focused on at all. Like I think we're, for a variety of reasons, like Jesse's not really um you know super excited about podcasting, but
But
himself.
there could be this category of like news analysis and commentary. And to your point, there might be a way you could get into it faster
That's I
by
see
bringing in an
that as an
established team.
example, not as something that we are like at all focused on or serious
Yeah.
about. Like, in fact, it couldn't be further from like the focus. But that's why I bring it up, because it's like, if let's say there was some fledgling sports podcasting business out there, or even like a bigger sports podcasting business like what Kenny Beecham has out
Hmm.
there, like I could see. And by the way, Kenny Beecham doesn't need that, but you could see like a more fledgling podcasting business out there that would benefit from the top of funnel audience access that a business like Bucket Squad has. And those two assets together could be stronger, or that podcasting business could be worth a lot more as part of the network of Bucket Squad talent and resources, and the ad sales capabilities that we might be able to bring. And so that, I've had conversations with audio people where they've pitched that, and it's been like, okay, that's something to think about.
Hmm.
I think you look at businesses like Epic Gardening, which
Yep.
um,
One of my
which
favorite examples of M&A done right, I think.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just a amazing example where like, who would have, you have to be like really smart to know that like you see like a gardening Instagram business and that has a huge audience, and you know that the margins on the sod business are like a really good business, and you're like, well, what
Yeah.
if we acquired these two assets and put them together and use this top of funnel to drive sales at a much lower cost of acquired customer for this already great margin sod business, and the
Yeah.
synthesis of those two things. Or so it's like, we're going to keep our eyes open for those types of opportunities, but like
Yeah, what would that style of opportunity look like for you guys? I'm just totally off the top of my dome making this up, but like
I don't
launch your
know.
own basketball footwear line.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think the basketball footwear line is like a pretty crowded. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
pretty
I don't know if the
competitive
margin is
space.
good there. I couldn't tell
Yeah,
you.
like I don't know how, like I'm not necessarily sure, acquiring a startup footwear line is going to unseat Nike and Adidas.
What are
But
some? Are there any examples you can think of that are like more higher ARPU business lines that you think would be natural extensions that you could clip together and benefit from the distribution
I
of
think
Jesse?
subscription businesses are
Mm,
interesting because they have recurring revenue and generally their cost to operate. Like, unless you have like big licenses, like, I mean, I worked in the fitness subscription space, which, by the way, a fitness subscription product could be theoretically like Wear Sports and, and activity. So, but that's not the right fit because it's not the right audience match. But,
sure,
that was theoretically a great business, but we were paying the record labels a huge license for every dollar that came in the business. So that became like a very bad margin business. But if you're not like, if you're keeping 100% of the revenue of your subscription, then you have to be thinking about like, well, how much money do I need to spend? How much of every dollar do I need to spend on like whatever sits behind the subscription paywall? And in some businesses that can, if you have a big enough scale of subscribers, that can be like a very efficient business.
sure.
But I think we have to think about like, what is that? And I don't think we necessarily know. I mean, there are
Yeah,
products.
I love the one of the things I like about the TCG and Epic Gardening example is it's a heirloom seeds are a very high margin, like 80 to 90% gross margin product, and they're consumable with high repeat transaction. So that's the other thing. It's like what can you find that is consumable and or has high repeat transaction value?
Yeah, and so that is like a breakdown of like what is a good LTV business and like what
Yep.
is a good, maybe if you think about LTV on like or what is a good LTV to CAC business, right? I mean,
Right.
I think for us, it's like the beauty is that our customer acquisition costs can be effectively zero because
Right.
we have this big top of funnel. And so, yeah, like what are the businesses that have good margins? What are the businesses that have good like lifetime revenue? And
Yeah.
how do we find and recurring revenue with low churn? But I think we haven't found that yet.
That's why we like subscriptions so much. I mean, one of my observations about how creators have gone about selling their own products is um, I think at least initially, like in the last 1 to 2 years, there's been more of a focus on yes, high margin, but a lot of things that have been a bit more transactional with lower repeat. I'd say the one exception to that is the food and beverage space. I find that very interesting.
I mean, again, and it's like Prime, Feastables. Like when
Right.
you're saying, like, can you point to examples of creators where like they've done things that you're like, I mean, we would love to have a product that has had the kind of success that Prime or Feastables has had.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
those are game changing business launches for those creators.
I just find, and I love that you brought up the term LTV. It's not necessarily a sexy term, but I think for a lot of creators, at least in my experience, it's a new term. A lot of creators aren't thinking about customer lifetime value. They're thinking about that first transaction. And so that evolution towards thinking about LTV is something I'm pretty excited about over the next couple
I
of
mean,
years.
and that's honestly like what I love about what I'm doing right now is that I love being a part of the creative, not a part of the creative process, but being like in service of the creative process. Cause I'm really not a part of the creative process. I mean, every once in a while, like I may get involved or like share a point of feedback or on the apparel stuff, say I like this design or don't like this design. But I feel like after having been in startups and having been in big media businesses and then all, that monetize with ads and monetize with memberships and monetize with e-commerce and subscription and licensing. And I've seen a lot of these models and I have a lot of the frameworks in my head on like, how do you think about LTV? How do you break LTV to, LTV to CAC? How do you break it down into like,
Sure.
retention or churn, and like what are the drivers of those things? That's a lot of stuff that like the people who are really out there making the great content,
Yeah.
not only are they like they just haven't been in environments where that type of stuff is like what you're doing and thinking and digesting every day. And like what I love about my job is that like I don't want to force our team to have to think in terms of those like consulting analytical frameworks, because that's so unnatural. What I want to
Yeah.
do is sort of like cherry pick that stuff, the concepts of it, and like turn it into like more digestible language and have like natural human to human conversations about like, because everybody understands like you don't need to say price elasticity or price
Right.
sensitivity in order to understand the idea that like more people will buy a product that costs less and fewer people will buy a product that costs more, and have a conversation with someone about like, well, what do you think our audience will do?
This reminds me of that like Elon Musk idea where maybe you've seen his rules, his like 7 or 10 rules at Tesla, but one of them is don't use acronyms and jargon. If you understand the concept as well as you think you do, you can explain it in normal human terms.
I mean, I had not heard that, but I think it makes a ton of sense. I mean, I feel like I have to be hyper vigilant about that because,
Well,
I'm
you
more,
came from McKinsey, so there you
I
go.
mean, yeah, a while ago, but like, yeah, like I just like the last thing I want to do is come in and be like I am inherently coming in as like a wonky nerd to begin with because I'm older and I have the places that I've worked. And so it's like I have to be conscious and vigilant about like not being like that. But also, it's like there's so much value in all of the instincts and the market knowledge and the experience of all the people in the company. And like the same way that they have to find ways to talk to me about YouTube data, YouTube analytics, YouTube best practices that like I can then wrap my head around, like I have to think of like taking these other principles and bringing them in like colloquial ways that we can talk about it, because the truth is that like I'm not the right guy to make all of these decisions in a vacuum. Like
Right.
we make much better decisions when we leverage like my structural and like structural knowledge and experience and broader media experience together with their native creator YouTube market knowledge. Like that's where I find like to me, you were asking before like creator COOs,
Yeah.
well, one thing I'll say is that I've met a handful of people in the similar types of roles, and I'm amazed at how different all the backgrounds are. Like one, I'm sitting at a table
Are there
with,
any patterns you see replicated over and over? Or is it just too early in the industry to
yeah,
tell?
I mean, one pattern I think is like humility and character.
Mm,
Like it takes a certain type of person to like be, to be like self-aware enough. And by the way, like I am not self-aware in a lot of ways. So like I don't want to say it like, oh, I'm super self-aware, but I do think it
we're
takes
all
a
a work
certain
in
amount of
progress.
self-awareness. Yeah, we're all works in progress. Uh to like step into these types of environments, to like know what you know and know what you don't know and like be
Yeah.
humble about that. But like I was lucky enough to be invited to a dinner with a bunch of other like COOs and presidents and CEOs of creator companies. And what I noticed looking around the table is like, one person's been in the digital space for a long time, doing like ad agency digital stuff. Another one came into this space from private equity. Another one was the COO of a venture backed startup for a long time, and comes in with like real tech operating knowledge. Another one came up through digital video production and has worked at all of the best digital, YouTube creator businesses. Another one was running film and TV physical production for 20 years and entered into one of those businesses as like a production person. And the business realized quite quickly, like, we need someone who has, who can wear a lot of hats to not, who, and knows the production space to also
Sure.
be the COO of the business. And so I was amazed looking around the table. It's like literally everybody at the table has a different background, and yet we're all kind of doing similar jobs. And yeah, what is the commonality among us? I mean, I guess the commonality is like, I think it's more of a generalist profile. It's
Yeah.
like
You
you
have to wear a
need,
lot of hats.
you have to wear a lot of hats. You have to have like delicate enough bedside manner to deal with a lot of different personalities and a lot of different
Yep.
types of people. You have to, any of those people with like whatever expertise they had, but like a lack of expertise in other areas, had to have enough humility to like be like, I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know. And I'm going to listen to people where I
Yeah.
don't know and I'm going to learn. I think
I also
curiosity.
think from the more successful creators, COOs, I've observed that, and I
Yeah,
think I put you in this
you've
bucket, by
met
the way,
more
in what you've
people in
said.
this space than anybody. What do you think is the commonality?
Yeah. Well, I think I liked um, I liked your point about being humble. And I think my sense has been, and I say this as a COO that has supported tech CEOs and tech founders. There's a difference, I think, between what I have done and what you do. And one of the biggest differences is that the creator who is also the CEO is the product, whereas the CEOs that I've supported are not the product themselves, and it just comes with greater brand risk, um, some potential for personal pain if things go wrong, and it requires a lot of trust. And so I think like the best COOs that I've come across uh, really lean into being humble, building the right level of trust with the creator, and then maybe this is the most important point, realizing it's not their business.
That is definitely like, I am very aware that like this business is that like, you know, everything you just said, that like the product of our business is so fundamentally built around who Jesse is and what, that like, I definitely think it serves me to be really mindful of that. Uh,
It's structurally so much more personal than tech. Now, there's also a lot of similarity, I think, between the CEO and COO role in the tech world, but
I also think, because of the point that you made, because every tech startup sort of has like a similar structural dynamic. I mean, obviously, there's a difference between consumer businesses and enterprise business. There's a difference between SaaS and like transactional business. There are a bunch of structural differences, but that the CEO or the founder is just a person who came up with an idea, and then a bunch of people are working in the service of that idea, versus the idiosyncrasies that you find one creator business to the next creator business, the next creator business, which are so much determined by who that individual is, how
yeah,
central they are to the content, and how that evolves over time. I think it's also not only humility, but also like an attendance to that idiosyncratic or that like uniqueness of each business. I think that like to be successful doing it, you really need to like understand what makes the business that you're in unique and tick, and like what are the sort of operating rules around that business. What are the things that you guys will do as a business and won't do as a business based on who the person at the center of the business is. And by the way, that changes, right? So like Theorist Media, which just got a big, I don't know if it's an acquisition or a big investment, but like they did a deal with Lunar X, and
mm,
now my understanding is that Matt Pat, who's been the face of a lot of those theorist channels, or um, is now going to start sort of doing more behind the camera or doing less in
sure,
front of the camera, and they're going to start building up more talent. And so, how does a business like that change when the CEO and founder of the business is no longer on camera? Like,
yeah.
does the business change for good, for better? Does it change for worse? Like, are there things that the business is willing to do now that Matt Pat is not in front of the camera and the focal point in front of the
It,
camera?
it it reminds me a little bit of the dynamic where this is an ongoing debate in tech, but uh, are you better off with the founding CEO, or at some point do you have an outside CEO come in? And it really does change the dynamic of the business. This is a little different, but
By the way, another one of these businesses that like I'm so impressed by, and people that I'm so impressed
mm,
by, is Complexly and Hank
mm,
Green and John Green. Not only because like I think Hank Green is just like the most wonderful person, and to be honest, like his willingness to take a phone call with me in the very beginning of my search was probably like the biggest thing to set a trajectory for this process to work out for me. But
interesting.
also like,
And he's a
he
real OG. He's been around for like 20, 25 years in the YouTube game, I think.
those guys are the most original OGs. But also, that business has evolved where for a long time it was, Hank was exclusively in front of the camera or predominantly in front of the camera. Now they have a lot of other talent in front of the camera. When Hank got sick, John stepped in and got in front of the camera. And it's like that dexterity, but the fact that they've also been able to like prove that that business can work in a variety of capacities, I think puts them in a great position to like, I think that business could be a lot bigger than it's big, and it could be a lot bigger if it weren't for the fact that they have real values that guide the way that they
Yeah.
grow that business. And I think that is partly what contributes to the longevity and the loyalty of their fan base, the longevity of the business, the loyalty of the fan base. But I think it also positions them incredibly well to pursue any variety of paths. Like they've proven that they don't need Hank and John on camera in order for that to be a
Sure.
successful business. So like 10 years from now, that business could be 5 times as big and still operating, adhering to all of those values. I mean, like that's a really impressive double bottom line, self driven.
Yeah.
They do what they want. They are like incredible. Those guys
Full
are incredible.
independence have evolved a lot over time.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
I
and
love that
like
story.
they generate, they employ a lot of people. They founded VidCon. I mean, those guys are
Right.
like, it's just everything that they've done. I don't know if you know about their socks business, but their socks business, it's like they have a socks subscription business that like is open for sales for 2 weeks of the year. They do a lot of like millions of dollars in revenue, and
Huh.
almost all the money goes to charity.
That's
I
very
mean,
cool.
like they just do what they want to do and they do it successfully. And it helps that they have two founders who are like geniuses. One is like a literary genius who's one of the most successful writers in the world, and one is like a science genius who is like
Hmm.
popularized science and math for the YouTube generation. I mean, incredibly impressive.
How big is your company life insurance policy on, Jesse?
Oh, that's a great question. Uh,
I
um,
ask facetiously because I don't know if I should divulge this or not, but I recall back in 10 years ago when I was at a private equity firm and we invested in Vice Media. We took out a very, very large life insurance policy on Shane Smith
yeah. Uh,
because he was constantly flying into war zones like Iraq to interview people.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, like Jesse, it's not so dangerous out in like the valley where Jesse lives and where we run the business. But it's a good thought and a good point. I mean, you think about professional athletes and like and performing artists, and like Lloyd's of London has these very famous insurance policies. So it's like,
Yeah.
if you're a professional, and by the way, if you're like an NBA player, like your contract is fully guaranteed. But if you're an NFL player, your contract is not guaranteed. And so it's like if I were an NFL player and I had a $50 million 5-year contract, I would
Yeah.
100% take out like a $20 million insurance policy on myself in the event I get hurt and I get cut.
Well, I bring it up jokingly, but you can point to there's a couple examples we've even brought up so far, the sort of Hank and Joe Green, Epic Gardening, Matt,
Matt
uh,
Pat, Matt Patrick.
Matt Pat, uh, all people who at different points wanted to take a step back from being in front of the camera. Either they were burnt out or they just wanted to do something different. Um, what's that dynamic like today? And how are you thinking about are you thinking about diversifying talent at a place like Bucket Squad?
I think it's always something to think about, and it's definitely something that can be um, a good move for any business to like diversify away from the key man risk.
Yeah.
But I think you also have to think about what your audience wants.
Sure.
And I think in order for us, and again, like I keep going back to the consumer and the customer. It's like
Right.
if we get a signal that the consumer wants to see more of the talent that are part of the ensemble that supports Jesse, then like that's a huge opportunity for us. If that's
Right.
not what they want, then like it doesn't, just because that's like a good diversification strategic move doesn't mean it's a good move for us. I would also
Yeah.
say it's hard to incubate talent and establish successful talent. Like we were talking about The Ringer and
Yep.
Barstool. Those guys have built really good models around that, but there
It's
are
hard to, so it's like it's hard to incubate them. It's hard to retain them as they get bigger.
again, when I say like The Ringer and Barstool, I think those guys have built really strong systems where there's this mutual benefit between the talent that is incubated and the business. And there isn't some great incentive for the talent to just like drop there's a reason why Kevin Clancy doesn't just like drop Barstool and start the KFC
Yeah.
media business. I think that
There's enough value. There's so much value there for him
and I think
that
it's important for
he's going to
these
stay.
businesses to figure out how to share that value with their talent and make it so that nobody it's not in anybody's interest to leave. I mean, but by the way, like we say, Barstool is a great example of who does it well, but they also learned an incredibly painful lesson with Call Her Daddy, which was
Right.
one of their properties, and there was not
Very painful, very public lesson.
for whatever reason, there wasn't a good enough value share there for Alex Cooper, and she was incentivized. And maybe it was the relationship, maybe it was a relationship between like her and the leadership, or maybe it was the value share. But for whatever reason, that didn't work out. It was very public. We all know how much, I mean, we don't know exactly how much money she makes, but we all know that Spotify paid a very healthy fee for her to be
Right.
exclusive or join Spotify, and that.
And now she owns the I think it's called the Unwell Network. So
Yeah. I mean,
she's done a pretty great job of going independent and then presumably incubating her own talent.
100%. So maybe she learned a lesson being on the receiving end. I mean, and by the way, it's no different than Bill Simmons, right? It's the same example. It's
Yeah.
Alex Cooper with Barstool, and then it didn't work at that place. So then she starts her own thing, and now she's learned those lessons about how to take care of talent and retain talent.
Yeah.
And Bill Simmons did the same thing, and The Ringer has had a much greater success retaining talent than Grantland did when it was owned by ESPN. I think for us, we have a lot of lessons to learn. Like we have to learn how to, if we're going to do that, we have to learn how to spin off and stand up talent in a way that like they can, we have to prove to ourselves that we can make individual talent successful, that we can transfer audience to them, that we can figure out what that value split is in such a way where it works. And we have to figure out.
I think part of what you're pointing out here is like it's a lot harder. It's way harder, more operationally complex to do it the right way than just saying, "Oh yeah, let's diversify." There's a lot of stuff you got to get right.
I'll also say, like, look at the examples where it's worked. It's almost all live to tape, lots of volume of episodes.
Interesting.
So like podcast, which by the way, most of what we're talking about is podcast in terms of these folks, like at least Simmons and Barstool and whatnot.
Team Coco.
Team Coco. If you're producing 3 episodes, the Bill Simmons podcast has a huge audience, produces 3 episodes a week. The episodes are 60 to 120 minutes long. You can have a lot of guests on, and you can have those guests come on repeatedly, and you can get a read on like, and then by the way, spinning that person off into their own show. You can have that person guest host an episode. Like Bill goes on vacation for a week and it's like the Bill Simmons podcast hosted by Ryan Russillo. Like that's a good way of like, what was the drop off in audience? What was the drop off in retention? Oh, the audience is actually hanging around. He's doing a good enough job. They showed up for the episode because it's the Bill Simmons podcast, but they stayed once they heard Bill wasn't on the podcast and Ryan was hosting it.
Yeah.
And maybe we should launch Ryan's own podcast. Like that is a much more organic
Yeah, to get signals about whether or not it's going to work. That makes a ton of
You
sense.
get a lot more data points, whereas like heavily produced and edited content is it's much more like TV. To be honest, the analog that I think about um uh the way that I think about like examples of ways that we could potentially spin off talent. I had this conversation this past weekend with someone in Indianapolis when I was out there for All Star. I said it's sort of like Cheers. Like we have to figure out like who is. Do we have a Frasier? If we have a Frasier, we could potentially like spin it off and
Yeah.
launch like a great independent channel or maybe an ensemble channel or something like that. But that's a much harder thing to do, and I don't think we want to do it unless we really think we have something really sorted out. But
Yeah,
we do think
you got
about
to
it.
test into it and then have really high conviction that you want to make a bet on it.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think for us, there are so many growth opportunities that we need to be thinking about. Like in the beginning, you were saying, so like, what which big swings were you thinking about? So like for us, I try to think about this from the standpoint of like, a Venn diagram. Like, what does the audience want from us? Do we have a strong signal that the audience is excited about this, that they'll spend
Yep.
time with it, that they actually want it, they'll be satisfied and they'll and excited about it? What does Jesse want to do? And like
Mm,
also the creative team, because anything that like he and they are not excited about is probably not going to be very successful. Like they have
that's a
to
great point.
really
Yeah.
believe and be excited about it. And then what has the sort of structural business dynamics that predispose it to success? Is it scalable? Can it be tested relatively inexpensively? Is it a two-way door or a one-way
Mm.
door?
Hmm.
Um, can we model it? In success, what does it look like? In failure, what does it look like? How much capital does it take? So it's like if we can look at opportunities across those three lenses and find the handful of filter the opportunities by those that sort of score well on those three dimensions,
Sure.
then we can start taking some swings, and hopefully those are the things that are likely to be successful. And we're not going to be able to launch like three things at a time and do them well.
Right.
We're probably going to have to do
Right.
them one at a time, and we're going to probably have to stack rank them based on what we think can be the biggest opportunities or the most likelihood to be successful or the most organic fit for our content and product and audience.
Yeah.
And as long as we like stay true to that methodology, I think it'll keep us in a safe place, or at least in the early going. That's the kind of like structural analytical rigor. Like that's
Yeah.
not such sophisticated rigor. That's like that's a lot of logic, like
Have you ever
who
read
would
the book called
uh,
you ever read the book called Thinking in Bets? The author is escaping
no,
me right now.
no, but
We read it
sounds
as a
good.
management team here. The core idea is essentially sort of what you're espousing, which is like so much of business growth you can simplify down to understanding like what are the core things that you're really good at, and then what are the experimental bets that you want to play, and then of course limiting your experimental bets because you can only handle so many at a time. Um, Running the bets the right way, figuring out what works, and then turning like experimental bets into core. And then if you can do that iteratively every quarter, every year over long periods of time, you tend to grow.
Yeah, I mean, I would say Spotify as a company like had a very good uh sort of disciplined system around that. I think the challenge that Spotify as a business has had is that those experiments have none of them have really turned into massive home runs.
Yeah.
So like the DSP business has been a huge success all along the way, but it also
Right.
doesn't deliver great margins because of what I mentioned earlier, the music licensing. So like podcast was a big bet, audiobooks was a big bet, uh, concerts and events was a big bet. And those were bets where it was like, all right, we're going to sink resources into them. And if we can stand these up as big businesses, if they can contribute competitive amounts of revenue to the core business, then we can fold them into core. And I think podcast has been folded into core. And I think podcast is a really good business for them. But I think it's hard you don't find a lot of businesses that become really good at a lot of things. I mean, I guess maybe the best example is Amazon or Apple,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yep.
Apple is a device business, but now they're also a software marketplace. And that software marketplace business really, really good. Um,
Yep.
Amazon is an e-commerce business, but it's also like a cloud computing business. And its cloud computing business is like amazing margins, amazing retention. It's also like a content streaming business. Like the way they pivoted Prime from being like a free shipping service to being like this holistic, like the biggest subscription membership business in the world, like pretty impressive. And
Yeah.
you don't see, and I guess Microsoft is another one. But like Facebook, for example, you can't look at like these ancillary Facebook businesses. I mean, with the exception of like Instagram, which was like a good acquisition, Facebook just sells it.
I think just to tie this thought up um, a bit, like that's bringing that sort of rigor around core and experimental and bets. That's the kind of thing I'm really excited about creator COOs like you bring into the creators, because I think if like my hope at least is my hope is to turn as many creators into billion-dollar businesses as we can. Not everybody wants to be a billion-dollar business. Some people want to have a smaller, profitable lifestyle business. But I think the point is like that's the kind of rigor you got to bring, and I'm pumped for guys like Zach and others in the ecosystem to bring it.
Thank you. I mean, I'm excited too. And like your excitement is the same as my excitement. I mean, the reason why I sort of my nose led me in this direction was I love media and I love content and storytelling. And the more I spent sort of the more time I spent like studying this environment, but also meeting people in it, the more I started to get a sense like this is really a growing pie where everybody is trying to help one another. It is not this zero sum legacy entertainment industry where like people's opportunity comes at the expense of like there's only there's only so many people who can eat at the table, and
Yep.
people are fending each other off. Like everybody is inviting everybody to sit at the table, and help one another. There's so much growth that like people can be sort of stealing share and still everyone's doing really well. And it seems like there's this potential that 20 years from now, the strong media businesses of the future will all revolve around people and personalities, because those brands have like, whereas like the peacock has two
Yep.
dimensions, Mr. Beast has three dimensions and like multiple dimensions. Like Mr. Beast has a personality and character and values that like people really identify with. Whereas like it takes a lot of must see TV and NBC News for people to really understand what the peacock means for NBC. And the truth is, what it means is kind of like in some ways it conflicts with one another. Like what NBC News means and like what Law and Order means are kind of different things, and so it's hard
Sure.
for a single brand to represent all of those things. Whereas um, creators are so specific and clear about who they are. I think audiences really coalesce around that, and so um, yeah, like I just believe like
I feel I love that vision, and I feel very confident saying that we share the same vision for the future. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom, Zach.
thank you for having me. I would just say in closing, and it's like so funny because I know like we're trying to end this, but uh, I keep having conversations with people, and I think other people in the space, like we all have this shared vision where we're like, it feels like the early days of the movie industry. It's like it feels
Definitely.
like Sam Goldwyn and Louis May are like coming out to Los Angeles and being like, all right, let's set up a studio. Like what, or like people often talk about that famous Walt Disney chart where he starts talking about how all the different parts of the, he lays out all the different parts of the business and how, you know, and it's like we know Disney is this like monolithic, integrated media company, but there was a period of time when they were just like putting it together piece by piece. And I feel like that's where we are right now. It's like it's so exciting. It's like the Wild West.
I think that's right. It's very early days, and there's an opportunity to turn hundreds, if not thousands, of creators into the next Disneys. And I think there's going to be a lot of equity value created doing that.
It will be, I mean, whereas like the studios, there were like 3 or 5 or, at some point maybe 10, and then they were consolidated into 3. What we'll just find is that there will be this will be a much more fragmented space. And I'm sure there will be a handful of winners, like super winners like Mr. Beast. And then there will be a lot of like top torso creators. But like the question really is, and I think this is what nobody knows, is like, how many billion-dollar businesses will there be? How many $100 million businesses will there be? I mean, the fact that content AI allows you to like dub in languages, and and these platforms allow you to reach audiences in all different languages and all different markets. Like, who knows how big any one of these businesses can be? I mean, I feel like Mr. Beast is just scratching the surface, and that's
I think it's
$3 billion, $5
reasonably,
billion
now
business.
we're obviously in the realm of hypothesizing, but I think it's reasonable to assume that most B2C and B2B categories will have some dominant personality that's able to sell a lot of really valuable product through the channel.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
worth a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you stop thinking about it as what's the size of the ad-supported media space, and you start thinking
Right.
about it as what's the size of the consumer space, then I
Yeah,
mean, then
or
you're
even
talking
business
about
services. Like, what
massive.
about a world where, I mean, I think businesses like accounting firms and legal services are just as likely to benefit from really good content and personality led distribution as a lot of other types of businesses.
I mean, if we think about Bucket Squad and we say, well, like we could be Dude Perfect. Well, Dude Perfect's already doing a lot of this, but like we could be like a big content creator. That's one vision. But another vision is, well, why can't we be like the ESPN of the future, where we are actually the primary distribution channel of all kinds of great content, sports content? Or you could say, like, well, what if we're like the Nerf of the future? And like we're actually like the country's, or Wilson or Nike
Sure.
or something like that. Then you start to like the sky is the limit. But like again, I
Yeah.
don't know. It's too early to tell like what's feasible. But what's super exciting is to even be able to think about that stuff. To like for that to it's amazing. I heard an amazing thing on Instagram, and this is the last thing I'll say. Uh, that said, this guy was saying that belief is the biggest driver of success and outcomes, not knowledge, not talent, belief. And he said, you could teach someone how to do something. If they don't
Mm.
believe that in the outcome, it's going to be wasted effort and they're going to fail. But if someone believes in the outcome, they don't need to know how to do it. Their belief will help them find a way to make it happen. And I know that like when I heard that, I was like, that is 100% true. Like, I
That's
don't,
inspiring.
isn't it? Right. And so I heard that and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So it's like, if we're sitting here and we're being like, I believe, I don't know why or how, but I believe that we could be like the biggest sports entertainment product business in the world. And if everyone in the team believes that, like, what in the world is stopping us from going out and doing that? Like,
It massively increases the likelihood that you will.
I agree. So that's the thing that like I get so pumped up about every
Mm.
day. Like I wake up and it's like, what a dream come true that I get to like work in a free, tolerant, warm environment, working on stuff that I'm excited about, where like that potential exists. Holy cow. Like pinch me. Like that is, all
What a change from the big three consulting world. I love that. Well,
I still have a lot of friends at McKinsey and love and have love for them, but yes, it was definitely not the right place for me forever.
thanks for taking the time, Zach. I
Thank
hope we
you
do
for
it again
having
soon.
me, Matt. This was so much fun. Always a pleasure, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creator COO. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Also, please consider giving us a rating and a review as this helps other creators and creator COOs like you to find the podcast. This episode was produced by Rebecca Donovan at Uscreen. It was edited by Richard Middleton at Longwave Digital, with artwork designed by Spencer Marsh. I'm Matt Estes, and you've been listening to The Creator COO. See you next time.